All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania here in beautiful, sunny Philadelphia. So I hope everybody's, staying safe and staying sane, particularly now that the COVID-19 numbers are starting to really skyrocket again. So stay safe, wear masks, keep your distance, and, protect yourself and protect your family. So today I wanted to talk about a study that came out actually in September of this year. And it's a bit of a departure relative to most of the studies I've discussed so far, and it's also quite a bit closer to the work I did for my PhD. So the long story short is the group found some basic neurobiological evidence that a certain behavioral or psychological strategy for the treatment of addiction may be more effective than we might have thought. So this is a study that was conducted in preclinical models, or in other words, working with animals rather than humans. And so right off the bat, we need to acknowledge that these are the kinds of findings that can help us to get a sense of what's going on in human experience. But while the brains of mice with whom this group worked and humans are obviously different in many ways, there are also some pretty significant anatomical similarities that might surprise you. So to give you a sense of the differences, here's a comparison of the brains of various animals. And you can see, there are some fairly meaningful differences, obviously. Like you can see that the human brain down there, sort of a ghostly human brain, down there, in the corner, and you can compare the brains of various types of monkeys and then rats and mice. And what's cool about this picture is that it includes the numbers of neurons that are estimated to exist in all of these brains, with humans having about 86 billion. And then up in the corner, you can sort of see, it's kind of dark. Let's just do this. You can, see a sort of warped depiction of what the human brain looks like compared to an elephant. Up there, an elephant, and a dolphin, and a gorilla, and then a mouse. So, despite these gross or, broad anatomical differences, each of these brains shares many of the same anatomical subregions of their brains, right? So to be specific, most of them certainly have something like a hippocampus, or a ventral tegmental area, or nucleus accumbens, or ventral striatum, amygdala, raphe nuclei, and so on. And, they're similar enough that someone who's become extremely fluent in either, human or murine, rodent, or even, other primates' brains, you can begin to recognize all of the structures I named in different species, so across species. I can recognize what the nucleus accumbens looks like in a human or in a gorilla, despite the fact that they are quite different. That they, on first glance, they look sort of different. But on top of that, the connectivity between these regions will look pretty similar in between various species, and there may be relative differences in just how connected various regions are. But there will still be projections, from comparable regions to the same comparable regions, right? There's a mesolimbic dopaminergic circuit in the human brain, and there's a very similar circuit that exists in a mouse brain, and essentially every animal that would come to mind. And so, they will all have, neurons that produce neurotransmitters with which you're familiar, things like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA, glutamate, the neurotransmitters with which you're familiar. And so all of this to say that while no other brain on Earth is, super similar to that of human brain, because of course if there were, that animal, could give us a run for our intelligence. But, that said, there are enough similarities across species that the reactions that other species have, what the behaviors they exhibit, can give us a very good idea of how humans would react. And in fact, in some cases, working with animals who have simpler central nervous systems and brains can help us to simplify the interpretation of various results. Right? If you're trying to understand how the mesolimbic dopaminergic circuit, the neuronal pathway that's fairly central to the pleasant reactions that people have to basically every drug, from alcohol and amphetamine to ketamine and cannabis, how the mesolimbic dopaminergic circuit responds to various environments or various drugs, it can be, very helpful to see what it does in a simpler anatomical signaling, context. So, imagine you're trying to figure out how the engine in your car works. Now you can start by observing and characterizing a complicated car like a Tesla or something, and given enough time, you could probably get to your answer, make some progress. But if your primary question is, how does the combustion engine work? it'd probably be easier to just work with a much simpler vehicle, or even just remove the minimally necessary components for an engine to work from a car and explore that simpler system without all the computers and all the other stuff that's accompanies an engine in a car like a Tesla, right? And so it's a similar idea. While the ultimate questions we ask in neuroscience are all about human consciousness and how consciousness operates and why people develop addictions, as well as the best ways to help people who are trying to have their addictions treated, we often start at simpler, more fundamental questions like how do specific neurons in a specific anatomical region of the brain respond to a specific drug? And then, how does the activity of those neurons change after they've been exposed to that drug for several weeks straight, and then it's suddenly revoked, right? The drug use is suddenly revoked. Since it's all part of a larger system, understanding how the specific parts of the entire system operate is critical to understanding how the entire system operates. So, with the system as gigantic as the human brain, somewhere around 86 billion neurons, and at least as many types of other brain cells like glia, how do you approach understanding it? It's dauntingly gigantic and complicated. So you break it down into smaller parts, small enough that we can understand them, and then you can build from there. So to give you a sense of this, right, when it comes to human psychology and behavior, psychiatric illnesses like depression, anxiety, addiction, and even things like PTSD, they can also be experienced by other animals. And they exhibit many of the same kinds of behaviors and responses that humans who are suffering from those conditions exhibit. And so they exhibit helplessness or inactivity or sleep disturbances or changes in eating patterns, changes in social interaction and reproductive behavior. So all this to say that we can get a sense of how these conditions arise in humans by understanding how our evolutionary cousins within the animal kingdom react. And more importantly, we can get a sense of how we can reduce the suffering that people experience by doing these kinds of studies. All right, so the study for today focused on addiction, right? Alcohol addiction, to be specific. And alcohol addiction, just like addiction to pretty much every other substance people use voluntarily, things like nicotine or opioids or heroin or oxycodone, or stimulants like cocaine and amphetamine as well, is closely associated with an incredibly unpleasant withdrawal syndrome that people experience when they cease chronic use. And these withdrawal syndromes are they vary a bit in precisely like how they're unpleasant, but they all share the experience of being deeply aversive and deeply unpleasant. And the withdrawals from some substances are the withdrawal syndromes from some substances are worse than others, or even life-threatening in some cases, like benzodiazepines or alcohol. But the experience of withdrawal is one of the reasons that people who are interested in reducing their use, it's one of the reasons they find it incredibly difficult, if not basically impossible, to stop using any of these substances on their own. And so, while there are resources available to help people looking for treatment, and, at the moment there's a ton of room for improvement when it comes to treatments for addiction in general, including alcohol addiction. And, when it comes to the causes of relapse, as people are working on staying abstinent, avoiding the consumption of any given substance, that's what we mean by abstinence in this case, there are tons of things that can lead to a relapse. And one of the causes, as the authors of this study highlight, is the exposure to various environmental stimuli, things like watching football together, or going to a baseball game here in the US, where, the consumption of various alcohol delivery systems, beer or whatever their delivery system of choice is almost like synonymous with the spectatorship of these sports. To be clear, like this association between alcohol and sports isn't like exactly an exclusively American phenomenon. Evidently, and I didn't know this until I was reading around for this topic, the consumption of alcohol within sight of a football match, soccer as we call it in the United States, as we learned it from the United Kingdom, by the way, has been banned for 35 years in the United Kingdom. And while evidently there's discussion of this ban being lifted as of a few months ago in the UK, I've certainly seen videos of fans of the sport that make it clear that we in the United States aren't the only spectators who consume excessive alcohol during big games. I also grew up with a close friend who's from Manchester, England, and he made it clear that those events weren't exactly like sober. So exposure to things like big games or movies and TV shows, with a bunch of like smoking and consumption in them, like if you've never seen Mad Men, it's sort of like shocking that this country even still exists, given how how much men evidently drank and smoked back then, just like during the day, and things like exposure to things like billboards or TV ads. These are things that can trigger relapses, but then also things as simple as being exposed to a group of people with whom someone used to consume their substance, or even just walking by an area where they used to obtain their substance, like a bar or a neighborhood, or whatever, can all trigger a nearly irresistible craving, even in people who've been working on abstaining from their substance for months or even years. And so all of these things are referred to as drug-associated cues, and simply speaking, they can trigger memories that someone may have of the experiences they had consuming the drug to which they'd become addicted, which can then even cause like the release of stress-related hormones, but certainly elicit memories of the positive emotional experiences that they had when they were exposed to this substance. There's some really interesting research out there suggesting that there's like a small sort of dose of the pleasant reaction that folks can recall back when they used to be using, just when they see these ads or these cues. So this group focused on the memory-related component of addiction that we're talking about here. And to be clear, memory is extremely complicated, and it involves quite a bit more than just like one brain region. Like, it's not just the hippocampus, but it's definitely uncontroversial to suggest that of the many brain regions involved, the hippocampus is pretty critical to memory. And I wouldn't call myself like an expert when it comes to the hippocampus, but I did end up spending about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, using viruses to try and figure out some of the anatomical relationships that the hippocampus has, and so I developed like an appreciation for the role that it plays in regulating everything from anxiety to addiction. And so in any case, it'd be pretty tough to find a neuroscientist worth their weight in ethanol, right? Who would suggest that the hippocampus isn't involved in the development of these types of associations that underlie the cravings that I've been describing. And so, of course, it's not solely involved in addiction-related associations. Pretty much every association a person might form that involves a specific location, in particular, like a specific location or like a general area with a specific behavior, and that could be like the consumption of a drug, but it could also be, other behaviors like, meeting new people or playing a sport, dancing, having conversations, and, just any other general sort of experience. The hippocampus is critical to where some of the most important neurons within the brain that are involved in that activity reside. And so that's the structure on which they focused for this study. And, I don't want to get into like all the specific details of the study because it's just not the kind of thing that would be interesting to anyone who's like not literally conducting this kind of work. And once again, I most certainly had, I definitely have issues with this study, from the behavioral data to the histology, but to be fair, I'm probably a bit of a snob when it comes to histology. So all of that said, while I do have issues with the paper, that I bring up with my former lab group, it was a cool idea for a study, and we can learn from it. So let's get into the findings. So the team used a combination of behavioral techniques. So like assessing how animals behave under certain circumstances following exposure to specific substances like ethanol. And they also used a technique called optogenetics. And, we'd be here all day if I tried to explain optogenetics, but, the short story is neurons will either fire an impulse or an action potential, or they won't at any given moment, right? And the things that determine whether they will or won't fire are these small little gateways that enable electrical current to flow either inwardly or outwardly. And, these little gateways come in various different flavors, and, different neurons have different combinations of these flavors, and depending on like the specific roles that those neurons play. And so just imagine that you are able to custom make one of those gateways, that those gateways that determine whether or not a neuron is going to fire an impulse. And it was specifically controlled by a particular signal. Like, imagine you could make neurons that only fire action potentials or impulses when you press the button on your phone via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, right? You push a button, your phone sends a signal, via Bluetooth or whatever, and those gateways either open or close, and that causes neurons to either fire or stay silent. So that's the same idea here with optogenetics. Instead of using Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, we're using specific colors of light. And so if those channels are exposed to blue light, they'll open. And if they're exposed to green light or red or yellow or purple, whatever, they'll do nothing. Okay, and I'm definitely oversimplifying, believe me, but that's the idea, right? You can control these channels. You can control whether or not those neuron gateways open or close, and therefore when and where neurons within the brain fire action potentials or impulses by shining some light, literally, on neurons that have those light-controlled gateways. You shine some blue light, neurons start firing action potentials. Blue light stops shining, it's like those channels aren't even there, right? And you can see that from the I think the first paper, or the proliferation of this technique. This was like one of the classic pictures. And so, and again, I'm oversimplifying optogenetics here, but for our purposes right now, that's all that really matters. And so by using this technique, they were able to control when specific neurons in the brains of mice fired action potentials. And the mice had been consuming ethanol for long enough to be similar to what it's like for humans to have done the same. And then they used another technique that I use to identify which neurons in the brain are activated during experiences that are specifically fearful, right? So imagine imagine I were to plop you all of a sudden on the back of a plane, right, with a parachute and everything, and you assumed you were just about to be pushed out of the plane. Now, unless you've already experienced this very unique and strange environment and experience, you're going to be flooded with a bunch of emotional reactions, not the least of which being surprise and fear. And the specific reason that you experience that flood of emotion is because a specific set of neurons in specific parts of the brain have started firing completely differently all of a sudden. And this specific constellation of neurons that's activated when you think back to a fearful experience, like when you're standing right at the precipice of a plane, that constellation is called an engram. Okay, and there's engram. There are like entire labs that are devoted to engrams. So I don't want to get into the whole story behind them, but just think of it as being that constellation of neurons that's activated when you remember a specific memory, right? If you remember back to the first time you heard your favorite band, or had your first kiss, or when you first talked to your crush, or even when you had the first time you ever had your favorite food, a specific constellation of neurons becomes activated in that moment. And that's what enables you to travel back in time to those experiences. And so this group identified which neurons responded similarly during moments of fear in mice with whom they worked, who'd been regularly consuming alcohol. Okay, so they identified those neurons, and then they targeted those neurons that were active during those experiences with their light-controlled gateways. Right, this enabled them to control whether fear-activated neurons fired impulses, whether the mice were exposed to a fearful environment or they weren't, whether they were in a fearful environment or they were not. And it's the or not part of the capabilities that they had in this experimental design that's pretty central to their findings. So what this whole experimental design enabled this group to do was to make those neurons that became active during fearful experiences become active in non-fearful experiences. So for any hippocampus nerds out there, this group is targeting the dentate gyrus, specifically the dorsal dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. And actually you can see that my own viral experiments ended up hitting the dorsal dentate in the banner image of my Twitter page, and I actually put some green stars towards the top there. You can't see my finger, of course you can. Those little green little nubbins up there, where the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus is. In my image, but regardless, it's just a part of the brain with which I became fairly familiar during my own research. And so using their optogenetic technique, they basically caused the neurons in this part of the brain, the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, to be more active than they normally would be. And it turned out this elevation of activity resulted in reduced manifestations of aversive behavior during ethanol withdrawal. So by artificially activating these neurons in this specific part of the brain, where with neurons that had become active during fearful experiences while undergoing ethanol withdrawal, it turned out that the mice tended to exhibit less severe manifestations of withdrawal when observed. And so, by artificially elevating the activity in these fear-reactive neurons, the group is able to show that mice ended up exhibiting reduced withdrawal-associated reactions. And so, once again, I have plenty of critiques of this study, but these are interesting data, nonetheless, because they may help to inform addiction treatments moving forward. And so, why is this interesting for that purpose? More directly, it helps us to understand more about the role that the hippocampus plays in addiction and withdrawal, and a topic that I happen to have spent years studying. But apart from nerds like me, the most interesting potential applications or implications of these data are related to the treatment of addiction. And so, I brought up in the beginning, like environmental cues, sports events, movies, and even just stress in general. Something that I didn't even get into so far. It's like a topic for another day. Some really interesting studies came out actually from one of my colleagues showing that there's a very unique biological reaction to stress that can, promote addiction. But anyways, all of these things can contribute to a relapse in somebody who's been working on quitting any given substance for a very long time. And so, what these findings suggest is that by causing a person's neurons that respond to fearful experiences to artificially fire, but specifically in safe and controlled environments, it may be possible to prepare people who are in recovery to be less likely to relapse during unpredictable, fearful moments or exposure to those cues. And so, in other words, you may have heard of a form of treatment called exposure therapy. Simply speaking, it's the kind of therapy that's based on controlled exposure of a person who's confronting a psychiatric condition. It's not just addiction, but psychiatric conditions in general, to environments that cause anxiety, but under conditions that will not cause any danger. It's typically used for the treatment of things like generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, even obsessive compulsive disorder, and others, right? And so the findings of this study suggest that there may be some utility when it comes to the treatment of addiction to something like exposure therapy. Like it might be useful when combined with treatments that are currently available, again, for the treatment of addiction. And so, of course, this study was most directly related to alcohol, but, and I am speculating here, I don't see why these findings would be inapplicable to, other substances to which people develop, dependencies or addiction. And, given the rates of drug overdose fatalities in the United States, an epidemic before our current pandemic, we are in dire need of new, more effective tools to help reduce the suffering that's emerging from addiction and overdose, particularly due to the effects that COVID-19 has had on overdose statistics, or at least correlated with this rapid increase or dramatic increase in overdose fatalities. Any insights that might contribute to better treatments and better outcomes for individuals seeking treatment for addiction are incredibly valuable, and from my perspective, in my humble opinion, warrant further investigation. And once again, these are preclinical data, right? So we still have to ensure that these findings do apply to humans. But I can imagine a bunch of ways, even in the age of COVID-19, that this kind of approach might be included as a supplement or component to an addiction therapy. Right? I mean, particularly given the sophistication of things like, virtual reality or augmented reality, these platforms can offer some potential strategies to help target those neurons that this group characterized, and essentially like render people a little bit more resilient to exposure to either stressful environments, unpredictable environments, or cues. All right, so that's what I have for you today. This is it has a title, but you can see this increased rate of overdose fatalities in the United States, just drug overdose in general, not any specific type of drug, although it's predominantly due to opioids and fentanyl. And I talked about this issue a couple weeks ago in a video entitled "We Are Failing to Confront Addiction," and I make that argument very vehemently. But okay, that's what I have for you today. Thanks for watching. I hope you're staying safe and sane, because if you're in the United States right now, it's game time. Once again, it's COVID-19 game time. And, you know, if you want to protect yourself and protect your family and the ones you love, I hope you'll wear a face covering and keep your distance. Thanksgiving, by the way, is my side of the family's favorite holiday. We make a huge meal. Everybody comes to enjoy. And the best part is that, you know, we have conversations that last for hours and hours and hours. And some of my favorite memories from childhood were Thanksgiving. And one of my most recent favorite memories was when my wife came to my parents' house and was subjected to conversations that went from, you know, noon until like 4 in the morning. Not something to which she was used, accustomed. But, you know, but I couldn't live with myself if we were the reason that my parents, you know, caught this bug. And, you know, I suggest you do the same for your elders this Thanksgiving. All right. That's what I got. Let's start the life half. Hey, Joy. Good to see you. You're the only histology snob I know. Yeah. That definitely became my reputation in the lab. All right. Why don't we start the life half? Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And just now on YouTube, I talked about a study that came out that may help us to pursue more effective treatments for addiction, specifically alcohol addiction in this case, alcoholism. But there's no reason that it wouldn't be, you know, that it is inapplicable to other, you know, forms of substance dependence and addiction. And so you can check that out and it's also a cool study, you know, from my perspective, because it was like kind of more similar to what I did for my PhD, the experimental design and the techniques. So you can check that out on youtube.com/anthropoid. And because I am so terrible at sort of promoting or you know, making it obvious where to find this content, and Joy was generously helped me out, you can find that channel in my Twitter profile or my Periscope profile. Hi, Dada, or Dada. Yeah, that was pretty cute. That totally didn't come to mind before you brought it up, Hal. All right, gosh. Javier, yeah. Oh, okay. Philosophical. Oh, hold on. Okay. Is the formation that a philosophy question for you? Is the formation of causes merely a mental construct, not based in reality? You mean like causality? I guess that's what I assume you're what you mean, that, you know, our sense of cause and effect. Right. Okay. Is it exclusively? I mean, I guess I am sure there are philosophers who would make that argument. By the way, Javier, you've inspired me to review, you know, things like identity theory and you know, the dualism and all the arguments that were so frustrating in college. But so thank you for that. But frankly, I actually don't know how somebody would make that argument that causality is like simply a neurophysiological. Well, no, I guess what you're suggesting is that our sense of causality is something beyond neurophysiology, that sort of in a dualist way, right? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that there's enough, there's a wealth of knowledge of physics. And it looks like, yeah, DC Hooper's here, Deanna Hooper. Javier, if you've not met DC Hooper, Deanna Hooper, she's a scientist, a cosmologist. She studies dark matter and in Europe. And she would probably have an interesting perspective on something like this. But I would imagine that there's enough of a wealth of knowledge in physics that events that causality exists independently of any human perspective. Yeah, Deanna. Yeah, I think there seems to have been like the group of people on Periscope these days seem to be a little bit less trolly these days. So, all right, yeah. Let's see. Javier's calling in. Let's see. There we go. Hey, Javier in London. What's on your mind?
Yeah. I don't know. I actually had a question, but I just forgot it. Yeah. Yeah, so I found out David Hume was actually a compatibilist.
Huh. Why do you say that?
I did some reading on him. If you read the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the section on like regarding free will and stuff, yeah, David Hume, very unexpectedly, was actually a compatibilist. I would have thought, he would just say, no, that's just hard determinism.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, is that terminology used? I mean, does he actually say the word compatibilism, or?
I haven't read quotations of him, but they say that the way that he actually argues for it is by, I think, redefining
free will,
certain concepts.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think he defines it like the example of, if you're in a room and you want to get out and you have that desire to get out but you can't, kind of like he gives that, I think, that as an example in trying to say that you can actually have that free will. Have you seen him?
Huh. Okay, well, listen, that's interesting. I certainly did not know that. Yeah, that's cool.
I actually did have some neurology related questions. Oh yeah, I remember. Do you have a favorite theory of that explains how neurons lead to qualia?
Okay.
Is there? Yeah.
So just so everybody's on the same page. So Javier is referring to the term qualia refers to. I mean, it's always phrased this way. It's like what it's like to experience a color or a flavor, and basically, like inherent to the argument that qualia exists, that qualia is like a meaningful framework to understand consciousness, is that there's mind stuff and then there's brain stuff. And that there is some irreducible component of these experiences. Again, like what it's like to look at a red rose, what it feels like. That's irreducible to neuronal activity. I guess I haven't seen like explicit like theories or whatever frameworks that like have like a whole, I don't know, like a whole, like a term devoted to them, to specifically argue against qualia. For me, from my perspective, I just think qualia, like that concept, is misguided. And essentially every single time I've seen somebody, again, like Searle, I think, argues with qualia, Nagel, it's always a fairly simplified understanding of sensory experiences. And like one that kept coming up, and I guess you could say that there is a qualia to the experience of pain. Pain is like super regularly used by people who argue against identity theory, or essentially argue for kind of dualism, which is like okay. So here's what's frustrating to me is about a lot of these conversations, is that there is this like hyper focus on defining on the meanings of words that we use to describe these things. And so just to give you an example, like I can't remember who was discussing it. Putnam maybe was the person's last name, Hillary Putnam, that how do we understand pain? Well, in the explanation they give, that would be the physicalists or the whatever materialists argument is that it is activity in type C fibers, which, like, that's partly true, but there's many different kinds of pain, and so the argument that they make is that, well, we know that activity in type C fibers does not encompass the type of pain that people experience when they're experiencing grief, or these types of less kind of direct, most like direct definitions of what we mean by pain. And so there is this hyper focus on okay, well, if pain isn't just the activity of type C fibers, then clearly there's something more to the mind and consciousness than just brain activity. But for me, that's like, you should be having this debate with like whomever publishes the Oxford Dictionary. Like, this has no meaning to people who are studying pain. there's different manifestations, there's different aversive experiences, all of which fall under the umbrella of pain. But that's just a limitation of our language. It's a failure of our language. It's not like an adequate description of that experience. And so for me, it's always two things. It's always this like hyper focus and like scrutiny of a word like is or a word like pain, and then extrapolating from there. And then also it's always just, it arises from very simple and insufficient awareness of the knowledge that we've developed to understand these things, like to understand the neurobiology of seeing the color red. Like in, what was it? It was Frank Jackson's right, Mary's Room, I think, model. I mean, like that's a perfect example of that. Sorry, I know I'm going on and on here. You can, I don't know if you can tell, but it's something that I've been thinking about now since we've started talking. But I mean, even Frank Jackson has gone back on his perspective on, Mary's Room. So for everybody that's unfamiliar, Mary's Room is this concept where, imagine a brilliant neuroscientist, multiple Nobel Prizes, right? Just the perfect neuroscientist who knows everything that there is to know about the events in the brain that occur when someone sees the color red. But this neuroscientist was born into and lived exclusively in a black and white room, right? Bereft of any color, or deprived of any color. And, she can explain the wavelengths that are involved. She can explain, the specific photoreceptors, the specific neurons in the occipital cortex that decipher color. But she has literally never seen the color red. And then one day, somebody comes in and shows her a big, red painting or something, right? So, and then the thought experiment goes, did Mary learn something new in that moment? And the answer to that question is yes, that is true. But again, it's a function of how we're defining the term learn. Like, the difference is that new neurons in her brain that have never been activated are activated now because she's literally seeing red. She's, those neurons are being tickled. But it doesn't mean that she has, that new neurons that she never would have known about have been activated. And so she doesn't learn more about the neurobiology. She's just having a new experience. And that's all that it means. And I think that's why Frank Jackson himself, who came up with Mary's Room, no longer believes that it's an explanation for, qualia, or an explanation for, qualia. Okay, I've gone on for long enough. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about what you said. I've realized that some people even, I think, deny qualia. If I've researched properly, I think Dennett at some point tried to say that it doesn't exist because I guess people struggle very much so under a reductionist perspective to account for it. You cannot see the qualia in these neurons. So if you can't see it, if you can't test it within it directly, the way that you can see the neuron itself, then how do you know that?
Wait a second. No. You totally can. Like that's just not true. So yeah, one of the most ridiculous arguments I've seen is that, when somebody sees the color red, nowhere in the brain is red visible, which is just a wildly unscientific statement. Like, you don't need for there to be red pigment within neurons to see the color red, right? So that was just, I don't even know how to talk to. I mean, it's like talking to somebody who's literally never taken biology. But yes, I mean, we can describe. Now, I can't walk you along every single neuron because neuroscience hasn't, matured to that level. But for sure, we can explain the experience that Mary's having when she sees red for the first time, right? So beyond just the photoreceptors activating, neurons, or, activating neurons in her occipital cortex that then decipher this as categorizing it as red, apart from that, she's having, like all people have at all times, emotional experiences that are informed by or influenced by that activity. She's having memory experiences where, she's thinking about, I never saw the color red, but I bet this paint, I bet there was red in, some of Monet's, impressionist work that I just couldn't see before, but now I could see it, right? She's having all these memories and emotional experiences, and that's all a component of what people, I think, consider to be qualia. When they're saying qualia, what they're referring to are the things that extend beyond just the sensory processing, like emotion, memory, cognition. But that's all occurring still within the brain. It's occurring in different parts of the brain. But, that is the mistake that I think people make when they still vehemently argue for qualia. It's just like, at this point, it's a failure. It's their failure to understand neuroscience. And that's it. And you can continue to say, but you can't tell me, what it's like to, experience red, even if you could tell me these neurons in, the ventral tegmental area are firing, and that's why she's excited about seeing the color red, or she's, these neurons in her, hippocampus are firing, and that's why she thinks back to, prior art that she saw in the past. You can tell me all of that, and that still doesn't satisfy what I want to come to an understanding of qualia. I mean, we come to a point where it's like you're asking, your standard of evidence that you're requiring is just an ever-moving target that will just never be reached, because frankly, and this is my own little, bias, I guess, people have a religious devotion to qualia. They have a religious devotion to not being, to rejecting identity theory, to rejecting, physicalism, to explain consciousness. And so that's, I think, fundamentally where this comes from. And sorry. Part of the reason I get so adamant about this is that I studied emotion and mood, and sensory components were critical to understanding emotion and mood.
So, I mean, what I meant was you don't find the experience itself within the neuron when you're actually looking at the neuron. It seems to be I agree that the neuron plays lights up, and then the person can report back to you that they're experiencing something, and you can see, okay, this area of the line of the brain lights up. But when you look at the brain itself, you don't see the experience itself. You see the brain lighting up. So my question is, that sensation itself, since you don't see it in the neuron, then how can you say it's like a part of it? I can understand that you say it's like a part of the process for the emotion to arise, but you cannot see it the same way that you're looking at the neuron.
So, okay, help me understand this a little bit. What do you mean by see the experience in a neuron?
So you can see a neuron with your eyes, and that's one kind of seeing. Now, you cannot see an experience with your eyes, like pain, for example. You don't see pain. So it's a sensation, right? It's a sensation that's felt.
But I mean, it's just another sensory experience. I mean, it's like seeing, but rather it's a different sensory experience. So of course you can't see it.
Even if it was color, even if it was the color red. So when I see red, that experience of me seeing red, that red itself, I don't see it when I see a neuron. Now, I admit that those neurons are involved when I'm seeing red, but I don't see red itself within the neurons.
Okay, so wait a second. So let me ask you this. I'm curious what your threshold is for accepting that the experience of seeing the color red resides exclusively within the activities that neurons exhibit. What if, you were to come over to Philadelphia after having, a nice dinner, some conversations, you permitted me to saw off the back of your occipital, the skull on top of the occipital cortex, and then I stimulated specific neurons, right, that I happen to know are implicated in that are specifically exclusively activated when people see the color red. And I stimulated them with an electrode, and all of a sudden you saw the color red. Would that satisfy? Would that be enough?
So my question would be, would you then say that the experience of me seeing red is contained within the neurons, or is it by a different method?
It's produced by the activity of the neurons.
I agree that it's produced in the sense like that, you know, if those neurons are not stimulated, then I won't see it. I could agree with an explanation like that.
Well, I mean, I can tell you, like, let's take something that is, you know, that is even harder to make tangible, right? So for me, I mean, I think that there are better alternatives available to people who argue for qualia. Like, for example, déjà vu, right? So déjà vu is extremely strange, and just so everybody is aware, déjà vu is that experience of familiarity in a condition that you know you have no memory of, right? So you're experiencing, like, I've been here before, I've had this before, I've seen this before, but you know that you never have, right? It's that second part that's critical, that you scrutinize whether or not this should be familiar. And so you could tell me that I can't point to any neurons that they themselves are experiencing déjà vu. You know, how could they? They're just cells. But once again, if you were to come to Philly another time after I saw the back of your skull back on, or I glued it back on, and then you enabled me after some drinks or something to do the same, but over the medial temporal lobe. Okay, so that's just a different part of the brain. Yeah, actually, I mean, if you were to look at the brain like a boxing glove, it's sort of like right in the middle of your thumb, right? And I stimulated that part of the brain. We know, it's been demonstrated several times, many times, that in the moment I begin doing that, you will experience déjà vu. And then, you know, once I stop, it's over. And once I start again, you're experiencing déjà vu once again. So while I can't tell you that the neurons themselves are experiencing something like déjà vu, I never would. That's an absurd statement to make. I can demonstrate to you that the relationship between patterns of activities, the neuronal patterns of activities, not only determine the quality of your experience, but they are required. They are necessary. They are both necessary and sufficient for that sensory experience, for that perceptual experience. And so, like, so if you want some form of evidence or some demonstration that's even better than that prediction, me making the prediction that when I stimulate these neurons, you experience the color red, or you experience déjà vu, or you smell, you know, burnt toast, whatever. If you want a standard higher than that, me predicting that this would be your experience and that experience coming to pass, then you're frankly asking for a level of evidence that you want something to be more intuitive than it can or should be expected to be, and no such evidence could be produced. So yeah.
Do you? I mean, you know, going along with that, would you then say, because you know you said that these neurons are involved in the production of this experience. So you know, some people speak of the brain as a receiver of consciousness. So when you know the neurons and so on, would you then say that every single possible experience that I am to have, in regards to like smelling something, or seeing all the spectrum of colors, all of those experiences are already contained within the brain before I've even experienced them. So like, say for example, I'm blind, or I haven't opened my eyes yet, I'm still a baby. Somewhere in my brain is already the experience of red not yet triggered.
Yes.
Trigger it before the person has even seen the color, if you know what I mean.
So basically, yes, right. So the baby example is a little tough because they don't see color, whatever. Let's just say that, you know, hypothetical zombie human that, you know, so that your ability to even experience any of these sensory experiences, you know, seeing the color red, is only able to occur because there are neurons that are specialized to enable you to have those experiences. So like when you say like the experience is already in the brain, like it's not like, you know, I mean, I guess you could phrase it that way, I guess.
Could I give you sure. Like a really quick example?
Yeah.
Say for example, there's this scent that is associated with mushrooms, right? And there's like, you know, some molecules that smell like mushrooms. Say for example, I've never smelled those molecules before. Instead of exposing myself to those molecules so that I have the experience of that, right? Couldn't I just bypass being exposed to these molecules and just stimulate the area of the brain where those molecules would have an effect, and for me to smell something.
Yes. Yes.
So essentially, I would be able to smell something that I've never, gone to the source.
Yes.
To kind of have that experience. Oh, okay.
Well, so, smelling is tough just because, it's one of the coolest sensory modalities. But, there's like a constant, almost evolutionary process that occurs within the olfactory bulb and within the chemoreceptors that enable us to smell in the first place. You're constantly generating new receptors. And so, that's why, like, when you go to, another country or something that has different standards for, whatever, hygiene and whatever, like they, or you drive through a part of New Jersey where there's a lot of, certain kinds of factories and farms. All of a sudden you're like, how can people live here? Like, when you're driving through an area with a bunch of cattle farms, like, it can sometimes smell like cattle, and it's like, how can people live here? Well, it's because there's this adaptive process that's occurring. And so, but fundamentally, what you're suggesting might be able to happen could happen. That yes, like, for the color red, for, even like your memory of the first time we ever talked, right? With enough knowledge, I could stimulate the neurons necessary for you to, conjure or re-experience that memory. So yeah. But listen, Javier, we've been going on for a while, and I really appreciate you calling in. But I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you have YouTube videos out? Like, have you talked about philosophy on videos?
Sometimes I make certain comments in comment sections, but I've never
Okay.
made a YouTube video on that. Yeah.
Okay, I was curious because I came by these videos of philosophy and specifically identity theory, and there's a dude that sounds exactly like you. It's like crazy.
Yeah.
Anyways, listen, man, thanks so much for calling in. I hope we can talk about this again some more because it's a lot of fun for me. Talk to you soon.
Next time, I have a set of questions, but I'll save them for next time, I guess. They were in regards to like sign language, but I can save it for another time.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. We'll talk next week. All right. See you, Javier. Javier, man, he's probably like most responsible for me diving back into neurophilosophy after years and years. Okay, so I am sorry, everybody, that I missed your comments. Have you seen the movie Advantageous? If so, I have not. Advantageous? No. I've never even heard of it. Okay. Why do you think so many people... why are so many people in fear of a virus that CDC says is 99.8% recoverable? I don't know if that's the correct number, but the reason is that, let's just stipulate that it's 0.2% or whatever. That still equates to a large number of people. And it's not evenly distributed. It's not like, that 0.2%, again, I don't know if that's the correct number, but is, evenly distributed across the entire population. Though it does affect people who are younger and healthy and so on. There's plenty of tragic stories that you can find if you'd like, but it sort of disproportionately affects elderly, people who are elderly, people who have other conditions, and also, comorbidities. But also, this virus has not been around for a very long time. It's remarkable how much we've learned about this virus in so short a period of time and developed treatments for it. So here are some of the things that I'm concerned about just a couple weeks ago. And I could go on and on about like myriad of different, long-term consequences or indirect consequences that aren't just fatalities, right? There's many ways to suffer in this world, and fatality is just one of them. But for example, like the reproductive organs of men were shown to have exhibited or experienced such severe inflammation that they were probably effectively going to be sterile, or at least it was going to be extremely difficult for them to reproduce. Oh, awesome. Yeah. Thanks for joining, Deanna. That was a pretty intense conversation. But hope all is well with you. And, we know that there are neurological consequences in some people for COVID-19 that, once again, it's not death, but It is, destroyed, or not destroyed, but severely affected cognition, memory, and it's only been around for, like less than a year. And we know that some people experience these very, very long-term syndromes from COVID-19, the long haulers. And what we don't know is that, many viruses can essentially remain latent, right? I'm not suggesting that COVID-19 does that or SARS-CoV-2, but there can be consequences from being infected by a virus that are not immediate, that are not acute, but manifest oftentimes at the most inconvenient moments of life, but, like years and years down the line. In fact, there's increased interest now in a theory of Alzheimer's disease that involves exposure to a pathogen of some sort, where you're exposed to a virus or a bacterial infection and you recover from that infection. You no longer are experiencing the inflammation, but perhaps it just tips the domino just enough to get the cascade for Alzheimer's disease to begin, right? These are some of the most difficult questions in science. And so to suggest that just because a small number of a comparatively smaller number of people actually die from COVID-19 right when they get it, essentially, or a couple weeks after they get it, that because of that we shouldn't be concerned about it, you might as well just be saying, I don't really care if my parents or my grandparents are gonna die. Like, dude, it's not gonna affect me. And even worse, in my opinion, is somebody to suggest that I don't care if your grandparents or your loved ones die, right? All the people I care about, we're young, we're healthy, right? So it's such an obnoxious, in my opinion, argument to make, and it's clearly motivated by something other than biology. So that's why. Okay, is there any truth to the rumors that contracting COVID-19 can cause the brain to age? Yeah, so that's sort of what I was talking about. That there is evidence that that there can be neurological consequences of COVID-19, and there was evidence early on. There was evidence from SARS, like SARS-CoV-1, where viral particles were identified within the nervous systems of people who had passed away in China. And then, time goes on, and now during COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, we have seen that hospitals have set up wards devoted to neurological patients with COVID-19. So yeah, this is not a bug you want to catch. This is, if you can avoid it, just because you won't necessarily die from it, or you're statistically unlikely to die. First of all, it doesn't mean you won't die. But second of all, does not mean that that's the only thing that that should cause you concern. All right. There we go. We have a caller, everybody. All right. I don't know what you want to share, but what's on your mind?
Well, hi.
Hello.
Do I have to give my name?
No. Yeah, that's what I mean. So, don't worry about it. What's on your mind?
My name's Joy, and this is actually me this time. It wasn't me the other time.
Right.
Well, along the lines of color, but going at it a different route. The recent study in Current Biology about them being able to determine the color a person is seeing based on the measurements of brain activity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to explain that more before I
Sure.
ask any questions?
Well, why don't you go ahead? So basically you summed it up. So there was a group that, using, I think, fMRI, basically were able to find a standard, this would be interesting to Javier actually, a standard pattern of brain activity in response to a standardized set of colors. So basically, it's always this question that I think a lot of people, whether they're in science or not, wonder, which is when I see the color green, right? When I look at this, I call this green, and I'm experiencing the experience of green, the qualia of green. And you would call this green too, or you don't know what I'm pointing at. You would call this green too, right? Or these flowers to be white.
Green, yeah.
Yeah, right, they're green. So how do we know that, your experience of this color or these colors are the same as they are for me? Maybe what I'm seeing is to you like purple. You would experience it as purple, right? So it's just like really interesting, fun sort of philosophical conundrum that's existed for a long time. And basically what this group did is they found a kind of standardized reaction to colors, no matter what they were called, suggesting that there is a color constancy is something else, but there is a sort of a constant to how all humans likely experience the same colors. So yeah, that's the sort of the bird's eye view of what they did. But was there something else you wanted to explore?
Well, the dress photograph that went viral in 2015, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
Where is it black and blue or white and gold?
Mm-hmm.
Is that then more of a difference in how people are experiencing color instead of it being an optical illusion and something dealing more with vision and the eyes? It's more of a brain thing than I would think, right?
Yes, yeah. So that's a great example. In fact, that would be another fun topic to discuss the philosophical implications. But so basically, what was going on there? If anybody doesn't remember, there was this image of this highly processed image of a dress that was sort of form-fitting dress, and it had various stripes along it, and some people saw it as white and gold, and some people saw it, as Joyce said, as blue and black. And it turned out that the dress in reality is blue and black, but some people were seeing these completely different colors. And in fact, of course, it went around the lab. Everybody was interested in this, in neuroscience, and people did see different colors. And even I, at one point, was able to sort of literally squint my eyes just enough, and then I could finally see whatever color I wasn't seeing. I think I wasn't seeing white and gold, and I was just able to get it for a sec, and then it just flipped back. And so here's what's happening. So our eyes, our visual system evolved in getting used to the sun, right? That was, and maybe the moon sometimes, but that was our primary source of light. And so our brains were sculpted over hundreds of thousands of years, arguably millions of years, to decipher color wavelengths in specific environments, right? And so there's a sort of computational trick that the visual system can do to adapt to. So basically, here what was happening is that for some people, their visual system was unconsciously integrating the fact that this dress was under fluorescent lighting or was shaded in such a way, and so for them, their perception of those colors was influenced by that sort of computation computation that the visual system does, whereas for other people that just did not happen. And so there's some interesting explanations for why that might be the case. I would imagine that there's some anatomical differences and maybe even some experiential differences that compel or that predispose some people to seeing colors in one way versus another. And I actually don't think that we have a really solid neurobiological explanation for why that kind of variation can exist. But basically that's what was happening, was that the visual system, which has evolved over millennia or millions of years, with the sun and the moon as the sole sources of light, maybe fire too, was in this strange environment all of a sudden with a highly processed picture lit by fluorescent lights. And so therefore some people's visual systems were just reacting in different ways. That was essentially, it's called color constancy. That's the sort of the topic that is applicable here.
Mm-hmm. And then the picture that came after it with the shoes being different colors, people seeing them different colors, then somehow that was correlated with, if you saw one color, it meant you were left-brained, and if you saw another color, it meant you were right-brained, which was kind of a twist on the dress thing, because they weren't saying, this color is this brain and this color is that brain, which I've always been skeptical of the left brain, right brain person idea anyway.
Yeah, that the notion that some humans are left brain or right brain dominant, that is I don't really know where it came from, but it is definitely a zombie myth that I think will always be with us. And it's what's nice about it is that it's very intuitive, and it is true that some things are what we call lateralized, like language is notoriously sort of lateralized to the left hemisphere. But that anytime you're saying any word or thinking of any word or reading it, both hemispheres of the brain are involved. And when it comes to that shoe picture, which was Joey's talking about, a picture of like a Puma shoe that looked like white and teal, but and some people saw it as like pink, I think. First of all, that picture was far more processed. It's kind of tough to discuss this without actually showing the image, but basically, yeah, no, it has nothing to do with whether somebody is right brain or left brain dominant. It just the same exact color constancy, color perceptual process that was occurring with the dress was occurring with the shoes.
Yeah. Well, people can stay tuned to your YouTube channel, and I'm sure you can show the pictures of the dress and the shoes.
Yeah. I should.
If they haven't seen it, although I think most people saw them, and they can see them.
Yeah, there's a couple. I was thinking about doing one. I don't know if you remember, like there was this audio like auditory like illusion that was sort of similar. Came out around the same time as Yanni versus some other word. It was like Yanni or whatever. Laurel. Yeah, you're exactly right. Well remembered.
Wow.
Yeah. I was thinking of doing just like a compilation of those things because they're pretty fun. But yeah, we'll see. Maybe.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for calling in, Joy.
Other people ask you questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for calling in. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Talk to you soon.
You too. Bye.
All right. Alligator Man has more views. Yeah, I know. It's weird how long that video's been up. I think I know what you mean. How many years of schooling, and do you have a job currently? How many years of schooling? Well, including undergrad, over 10 years. And then the PhD was like 7 years, I think. Yes, I have a job. I work in science policy for the state of New Jersey. And did I study at Penn? Yes, I studied at Penn. Ben Franklin's Penn. Are you going to answer a serious brain question? Well, that's up to you. Why don't you ask one? I wish to change colors from blue to white. Oh, wow, really? Huh, interesting. Are you a neurologist? I'm a neuroscientist. It's sort of similar. Oh, shoot. Just lost you. I am a neuroscientist, so I have a PhD rather than an MD. And it also means that I am more interested in understanding consciousness rather than treating it. Rather than treating maladies that arise from the brain. All right, Chris, I think we're connected. Chris in San Francisco, what's on your mind?
Oh, that's a good phrasing there. What's on your mind?
Exactly.
I'm taking a community college course in acting, and so for the first time in about 30 years, I'm having to memorize lines. And I'm finding it's going a bit slower in my 60s than it did when I was in my 20s. Anyway, some of my old tricks are just to use repetition. Mm-hmm. But also I use like a picture association while I'm memorizing. I actually visualize what I'm saying. So if it's somebody down by the river, I visualize somebody down by the river, etc. As you age, I'm assuming it's true you've lost some of your abilities to memorize, or can you enhance those abilities, or does it pretty much stay the same as long as you live?
Yeah, it's a great topic.
I'll hang up to hear your answer because I'm multitasking. I'm doing the dishes while listening to your wonderful answer.
I know that game for sure.
Thanks.
All right, yeah, thanks for calling in. So first of all, yes, it is true that memory does deteriorate as we get older, and this is due to a whole variety of changes that occur in the brain. Everything from ultimately it's because the brain becomes slightly less neuroplastic. There's less sort of synaptogenesis going on. There's less neurogenesis, specifically within the dentate gyrus going on. The neurons themselves begin to essentially just become more rigid, where the neuronal membranes, it's not as easy for receptors and ion channels and things to move along the surfaces of neurons, move along the surfaces of synapses, and so it's not as sort of cocked and ready to take in new information and adapt to it. And so that is literally why, why my daughter, who's almost 2, can learn words just like at an incredible clip. Learn words in different languages, and she's, speaking in sentences. It's like overnight she's learned a ton of new words. That's just not how it would be for me, right? Or presumably for you. So there's that. Now, there's actually such a thing as the memory Olympics, right? Where people, compete in their ability to, memorize strings of pi, the digits of pi or things like that. And it is remarkable that, some people can clearly exhibit like some really impressive memory. And sort of central to what I've always seen, and I've, had conversations, somebody in one of our connected labs was a hippocampus guy. And, I asked him like, what do you think? And there is this thing that the brain automatically does, not only within memory, but within just like within the motor system and within a lot of processes, which is called chunking, like chunking. And basically what happens is that, imagine as you're trying to learn how to swing a baseball bat to hit a baseball, right? If, you were anything like me back in the day, they'd said, square up to the plate, arms back elbow out, obviously don't hold it like that, but and swing, have follow through with your swing, a bunch of steps, right? A bunch of, independent sort of motor events that you are instructed to execute. As you get better and better at, or more and more familiar, develop more expertise in baseball, instead of saying, okay, square up, arms up, back elbow out, follow through, it's just all those motor behaviors are chunked. And so squaring up and getting ready to hit is all just one thing. It's all just executed. You press one button and it all happens, as opposed to this button, that button, to get everything to happen. So when it comes to memory, memory more broadly, and for, memorizing just words, first of all, I think it is very prudent to, give it some depth, give it more depth than just the words themselves in a specific order. Anthropomorphize it, right? Make it into, imagine it, visualize it if you can. But then there's also chunking, right? Where, instead of trying to learn each individual word, you learn a sentence, and then you chunk words into, so instead of like, I'm looking right now at a sentence that says antagonist at AMPA receptors and kainate receptors, and slightly at the NMDA receptor. So instead of antagonist and then at and then AMPA and then right? Instead of doing that, antagonist at AMPA and kainate receptors, right? And so that's referred to as chunking. And so these types of strategies can definitely, some people use the mind palace kind of, which is sort of similar to what you were suggesting, where, you sort of use a spatial environment as a mnemonic device, as like, you remember a certain feature of whatever, a script or something like that because in your mind palace you had associated this sentence with, this statue on a table, right, or something like that. But yeah, through whatever, I would suspect, and this is speculation, that some of these strategies are superior for some people than they are for others, right? So in other words, like the mind palace strategy might be ideal for you, but, for somebody else, it might be that, chunking or some other, just rote repetition might be beneficial for you, or for somebody else. So yeah, those strategies can help to compensate for yours and my, or your and my, deteriorating brains. Good luck. I have it in my grandma house. Oh, I bet you're referring to COVID. I'm sorry to hear that. I have a question. Spicy food make heartburn? Read a more. I don't know if the spice itself is what causes like indigestion and stuff. Could be. I'm not sure. Human nature is to be as selfish as possible. Nobody should be surprised. Yeah, right. Well, but I refer, Scott, you're referring to like the COVID-19 numbers in the United States. There's no good reason that the United States has like more cases and more fatalities than, that like, I think there's an interesting philosophical conversation to be had there, but yeah, there is no justification. Just being selfish, I think, isn't enough. All right. More like gay scientists. Like a scientist that studies gay? There's plenty of gay scientists. I, however, am not one. Your birthday is Pi Day. That's pretty cool. Thanks for answering. I thought you were ignoring me. No. At least not intentionally. There's another one with the sound of a toy that said brainstorm green needle. Huh. I don't remember that. Okay. Let's see. I could have sworn I saw... Oh, have you studied much about Myers-Briggs, cognitive function stacks? What are your thoughts on that? So I'm not familiar with cognitive function stacks are a part of the Myers-Briggs test. But yeah, so the Myers-Briggs test is... many of you are probably familiar with Myers-Briggs, even if you don't remember that name. It's like if you're an INTJ or an ENFP, right? And so basically it's like it purports to categorize people's personalities and essentially character into discrete components where you're either perceiving or you're judging, or thinking or feeling, extroverted or introverted. And fundamentally, so that that test was not developed by like neuroscientists. I think it was developed by people who were like working in marketing or something. And generally speaking, that test is not considered to be sufficiently comprehensive or accurate to successfully actually characterize some essential component of who you are. It's clearly measuring something, so it's not completely pointless, but there's some assumptions that are made intrinsic to that test that I think aren't based on any evidence. And so these are things like that there are features of your personality that are just essential to you, that do not change, that you're either an extrovert or you're an introvert, or something like that. And like take it from me, that I have taken the test, and that specific one, extrovert introverted, has changed several times. And so I just, it's not based on a lot of like hard evidence. So yeah, but it's fun. It's fun. Yeah. Why do liberals have way less brain cells than conservatives? I don't really know what you're talking about. That's the funniest. That is like a serious attempt at like, it's like a serious version of it's a theory. It's a serious version of like the whole like liberals have a brain disease or conservatives have a brain disease, but like this time it's like they just have fewer neurons. First of all, that's not true, and second of all, like I think it's a little immature to suggest that people who disagree with you, I'm assuming you're conservative, you're on the right, anybody that disagrees with you is diseased somehow. Like I have very strong political beliefs, and I just don't think that somebody who has different beliefs has a brain disease. Like the difference does reside within their brain, the reason that they disagree with me, but it is not pathological. Okay, do I play FNAF? I don't know what that is. Final FNAF. Oh, Five Nights at Freddy's. I've never played it. I do know what the game is. That would be fun. That would be fun to play sometime. I'm really looking forward to that game, Cyberpunk. That looks awesome. Hey, I'm an alcoholic in recovery, not sure what to ask, but addiction is always interesting. Sure, so Hunky Darlene. I talked about a new study that came out. So it's more of a basic neuroscience, the type of neuroscience that I did, meaning like basic research than a lot of the studies that I've talked about. But basically what they found in preclinical models was evidence that something like exposure therapy or just some strategy to target specific neurons within the brain that are activated in fearful experiences, stressful experiences, if you can sort of essentially practice, if you can help people to practice by activating those neurons by one way or another prior to being exposed to cues, that can cause craving, if you can do that, then it may be the case that severity of withdrawal from drugs can be less severe. So you can check out, obviously there's more to the study than that. It's youtube.com/anthropoid. All right, ENFP. I think I was an INTJ and then an ENTJ. I can't remember though. It strikes me as marketing. His YouTube video on politics and biology. That's right. Oh, thank you, Joy. Yeah, I do. Why do they catch TDS? I assume you're referring to Trump derangement syndrome. Yeah, because it's politics, man. People have strong opinions about politics. It's not derangement syndrome. Why do people on the right have, you know, Hillary Clinton derangement syndrome, or right, Barack Obama derangement syndrome? It's the same thing. I feel like I didn't heal right after my car accident. My doctors to like to hear this. Oh, your doctors don't like to hear this? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I was a campaigner, whichever one that was. All right, hello from Russia, America people. hello from America, Russia people. All right, do you use the DSM-5? I don't have a clinical practice, but in research, yes, the DSM-5 can be really helpful to you know, the DSM-5. So just so everybody's on the same page, the DSM-5 is literally a manual, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the fifth one, and it is basically like the manual that physicians use or to diagnose, you know, things like generalized anxiety disorder or autism or, you know, these various conditions. And it's based off of statistics, right? And various decisions are made over the course of every edition based off of the experiences of a clinician. So, for example, in one DSM, Rett syndrome was considered to be a part of autism under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder, whereas in the next one it was not. And it's always these a controversial sort of debate whenever they make those changes. But what makes it useful is that in basic science, having a sense of the experiences that clinicians have had, you know, trying to improve the lives of people who have similar symptoms, right? Like this tends to work, you know, when patients come in with these symptoms, you know, they have sleep disturbances, they're not eating correctly or normally, they have no motivation, the things that used to give them joy no longer do. They tend to all have similar symptoms, right? And they tend to all have similar like emotional reactions, and they tend to respond best to similar treatments. So we're talking about depression, and you know, certain treatments are more effective for depression than others. And so from the perspective of a scientist, it doesn't really define how I think of depression, but it does help me to, you know, think of or forecast all the different brain regions that would be involved in depression when I'm trying to hunt them down and identify how they work and potentially augment the theory of depression. But it's sort of like a very loose kind of map that we can use, not exclusively. We definitely don't only rely on the DSM to devise our questions and experiments, but it is helpful. Yeah. Is there any truth to the? Oh right. Okay. Okay. A bruised brain. Jeez. Sorry to hear that. Jeez. Okay. Invisible blessings? Sorry. I'm so bad at picking up on clever handles. Will it ever be possible to transfer human brain personality to another person? So that's a really interesting question. You know, can you do a head transplant or a brain transplant, or do you even need to do that to transfer somebody's consciousness to a new brain? Some of these questions do have very likely answers. Like, for example, that latter example of transferring your consciousness to another brain, right, independently of your brain. Could that ever be possible? Almost certainly not. Because if you know, you adopt the sort of broadest perspective on consciousness that exists within neuroscience, that your consciousness is the thing your brain produces, they're essentially synonymous. That if you were to try and do that to a new brain, then you would have to essentially resculpt that new brain to resemble yours, to resemble what yours was. And that is the only way that, you know, the only way that we could transfer your consciousness to another brain is if we could literally change the anatomy of the other brain, the microanatomy, which you could theoretically do. I mean, you could. It would be extraordinarily difficult. What would be easier is a head transplant or a brain transplant. Head transplant would almost certainly be much easier than a brain transplant. But and believe it or not, that's been attempted. Basically, I think 2017 was the time when Sergio Canavero, I love that name, Italian neurosurgeon, claimed that he gave a talk this very boisterous, arrogant talk where he said he was going to be the first surgeon to successfully conduct a brain or a head transplant. And years went by, and clearly you haven't heard of it happening, right? Because if it had, you would definitely know about it. Anyways, so, and just like, I think at the end of 2018, he had developed a partnership with a group of Chinese neurosurgeons, or a Chinese neurosurgeon with a big team, clinical team, to actually conduct a head transplant. And they did do a head transplant between cadavers, so between dead bodies. So not, it's still super impressive, but it's not exactly, if I'm going to have my head transplanted, I prefer for it to be on a living body. But anyways, and so I would be surprised if they hadn't actually attempted it with a living human. We just don't know about it because it didn't work. However, head transplants have been conducted between animals, believe it or not. So, you can see these sort of like kind of macabre videos of like a dog that had its head transplanted. There's also been studies where the heads, like a second head was attached to a rat. It's just grotesque to look at. I tweeted that out a long time ago. You can check it out on my Twitter. And the problem with all of these is that, and then I think a non-human primate, I think maybe like a macaque, or like a rhesus, or I think it was a rhesus macaque, did a head transplant, and it is alive for a period of time. It's not conscious, but it is moving, and the same is true for the dog. So theoretically there's something to it, but the problem is that none of these transplants have ever survived for very long, right? So even the two-headed rats, they were all euthanized after I think 36 hours on purpose. And so we don't know that anything like a transplant could actually be successful. But let's just say, I should say. So just because it hasn't been successful so far doesn't mean that it's impossible. And so it theoretically, it could be possible with like a perfect neurosurgeon. It would be possible. The brain, consciousness, they all obey the laws of physics just like your, fingers do, right? And, you can do a finger transplant if you want, I guess, but it's tough. Or you can do a heart transplant, or you can do a, lung transplant. It just blows my mind that you can do that. But just like those, you could theoretically do it with a head. It would just be dramatically, orders of magnitude more complicated. Now, can you transfer your consciousness to something other than a brain? That's an interesting question. We don't know the answer to that for sure. My, speculative answer would be yes, it is possible. Extraordinarily difficult, and there's probably multiple ways that you could try and make that happen. But for me, that is the most likely avenue towards something like immortality, which is, enabling your consciousness to continue to reside on a computer system of some sort. But, again, it would be extraordinarily difficult. Okay. What about that chip that they're testing on mice brains that connect to the web? So I assume you're referring to Neuralink. And maybe I'm wrong, but so Neuralink is the goal of that company. That's Elon Musk's new company, or sort of new at this point, I guess. It's been around for a year plus, but the goal is to develop a whole brain computer interface. So a system that would allow your brain, your consciousness, to interact directly, seamlessly with a computer system, with the internet included, but then also other people's brains, other people's consciousness. So the sort of bandwidth, your ability to communicate via the internet is sort of limited by how fast you can type, right? How quickly you can type, or how good speech to text technology is, and your ability to move the mouse or move your fingers. Where with this it would be instantaneous, and so that is theoretically possible. And they did do a demonstration of what they call a Neuralink, just one small group of electrodes, and it was interesting. I mean, it was impressive, but insufficient. Not even close to what we're talking about here. Anyways, it's not all insufficient. I mean, there's a lot to that story, but if you're interested, I talked about it on YouTube several weeks ago, youtube.com/anthropoid. You can get to it through my profile. What about transferring body sensations like pain? like in Black Mirror. I don't recall an episode where they did that, but yes, like some people say brain like a computer, and computers can have new batteries. So when you say like, could I induce the experience of pain if you were to have a whole brain computer interface, right? And I had perfect access to essentially any part of the brain of your brain that I would like to manipulate. Yes, it would be theoretically possible for me to induce the most blistering traumatic pain that you've ever experienced. And it gets you a little bit freakier than that. So imagine that's the case, but then imagine that I am interested in having some terroristic attack conducted, right? But I don't want to do it. I don't want to get in trouble. And, I can't convince anybody else to do it. Well, theoretically, I could hack into your Neuralink, program it such that you feel excruciating pain if you're not actively preparing and beginning to, execute a plan to blow something up, right? So if you're not actively working on that, you're experiencing severe pain. That would be essentially you have gained control over somebody's behavior. Even worse, I could make it so that you would want to do it. That not only it's not your idea, but you would want to carry out these events yourself. And on and on. I go into a couple different examples on YouTube. youtube.com/anthropoid. What do you think about new science saying the gut and heart have a brain of their own? Yeah, Tim Olson, that's an interesting topic. So I think that is a bit of an exaggeration by some folks on Twitter. It's an exaggeration by some scientists, to be fair, but then also some like science journalists. So first of all, it is true that the gut has a very sort of sophisticated and robust nervous system. It's called the enteric nervous system, and it essentially synthesizes a full complement of neurotransmitters like the ones with which you're familiar, like serotonin, dopamine, the GABA, and also it can function essentially completely independently of the brain. It doesn't require the brain to do its job. The heart has, devoted neurophysiological, tissue, but the difference is that neither of them really qualify as brains. They have just a lot of neurons in a bucket isn't a brain, right? They have specialized activities, and one of the things that they do not make is consciousness. They regulate nutrient absorption, they regulate motility, these types of things, but they aren't composed, they aren't arranged in a structure that would sustain something like consciousness, because there was no selective pressure, there's no evolutionary pressure to make that happen, right? Okay, we're getting oops. Is it gonna go? All right. We have a caller. Hopefully the connection works. I am shocked that my internet hasn't failed. Okay, it looks like we're connected. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hey boy, what's going on?
Not much. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
I'm a rocket scientist.
Wow, I don't like rocket scientists. I don't believe them. I don't respect rocket science. It's barely even a science. Yeah, that dude sounded like a troll, like the first word he said. Hey, boy. You're only smart on one aspect of life. I would destroy you on any other topic. You're exactly right. That is 100% true. Yep. I don't claim to be. I'm no smarter than anybody in this room. It's just I've spent a lot of time studying the brain. It's my job to know about the brain. But that certainly doesn't make me a genius or any smarter than anybody else. So if I'm putting off that kind of vibe, excuse me, I'm sorry. It was not my intention. Okay, so it looks like we're getting a call from, I believe, Claudio in Brazil. Am I correct?
Yes. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. So I was thinking to ask you about something I noticed a while back. When I go to sleep, often it happens that when I close my eyes, and it's all dark, like an even level of darkness in the room. Not 100% dark, but dark enough, and then I close my eyes, and the normal thing that happens is you see like some
some bubbles of light, floating around, and you see those patterns, like especially if you just close your eyes. I mean, if there was a lamp on, and then you know what I mean. But
Yep.
There is something very specific that has started happening, which is I started at one point, if I at the same time relax enough and concentrate my eyes as if I were looking into something, even though I am with my closed eyes, then I started seeing patterns, like how can I say, like geometric patterns, like
Yep.
things that shapes that change. Sometimes they look like a watermark, like they're very blurred, and sometimes they get more precise, more defined. And then after many of those things, many times happening like this, I started seeing faces, very small, tiny faces, and they're not like human faces completely. Like they're like almost cartoonish faces that changes very quickly morph from one face into another, or sometimes into a shape, and they're very tiny in size. And I'm just curious about this because it's really like, it sounds like something magic or something, but I'm sure there is an explanation for all that.
Yeah, I love this topic. So as several people in the chat have highlighted, what part of what you're experiencing are called phosphenes, and so these are it's a really interesting way to understand the visual system. So these are byproducts of spontaneous activity among the parts of the visual system that are responsible for seeing light. And so just because of the way that the visual system is organized, it's very strange, but basically, like, the way photoreceptors are stimulated by photons, they're actually being inhibited. They're actually being silenced when hit by a photon. And so there is this sort of probabilistic, that there's just a likelihood that there will be just very transient, very short-lived, and spontaneous activity among those receptors, but then also among neurons throughout the rest of the visual system, that will then therefore be perceived as a visual experience. And this is particularly the reason, or this is why this tends to happen when it's dark, certainly when you have your eyes closed. But then also, like, if you let's say you're laying in bed and you're looking at a light, and then you turn all the lights off immediately and close your eyes, there will be this lingering image, right? It's called an after image. And it's a similar sort of process where these components of the visual system are sort of adapting to this sudden change in light levels. And so you still have this perceived image in your visual system that is not based on actually seeing anything, but you're still experiencing it. So yeah, phosphenes are one. But then I also find it very fascinating when those visual experiences take on a sort of geometric component to them, and even sometimes like faces, like a prosopagnostic, or no, I'm sorry, a pareidolia experience where you're seeing faces where they aren't actually there. So I'm sure that there are different theories for why this happens, but here's what I think is the best one. So our visual system is extraordinarily complicated. Something like a third of our brain is devoted to vision. And it has different sort of components of different layers of neurons that do different things. Some neurons are devoted to perceiving straight lines. Some neurons are devoted to seeing diagonal lines, and some different ones are devoted to seeing diagonal lines that move. And it gets more and more complicated, up to the point where you'll have neurons that are specifically devoted to seeing fairly complicated shapes together, right? And so those neurons can be spontaneously active. And so what happens when those neurons become active? The same thing that happens when they become active because you're looking at something. And that is, you experience that visual experience. However, part of the reason for why it's so sort of attenuated and subtle, and it's not like you're literally looking at a temple, right, or pagoda or something, is that those neurons are not actually being stimulated. It's just spontaneous activity from those neurons. And so it's like a softer, subtler version of actually seeing these real patterns. And then when it comes to faces, humans evolved to be extraordinarily sensitive to faces, to facial expressions, particularly the eyes and the eyebrows, but the face in general. And so there are neurons that are devoted to specifically, deciphering different facial expressions, different face shapes, right? Different skin colors, different hair color, all of the various varieties of human faces. And so similarly, once again, these neurons, again, that are highly sensitive and very, very, important to our visual system, they can just become spontaneously active. And so when your visual system is devoid of any external stimuli, those neurons can become spontaneously active. And that's what's going on with phosphenes. But this is also true for auditory hallucinations that can occur. If you've never tried a sensory deprivation tank, it can get very intense, where visual experiences can occur, auditory hallucinations can occur for essentially the same reason, that those neurons that are dedicated to deciphering different components of auditory processes, hearing, become spontaneously active. And last thing, and then I'll shut up, certain drugs actually amplify that spontaneous activity. And the drugs that do so would be unsurprising to you. Psychedelics do that. Cannabis can do that. But then also over-the-counter medications like diphenhydramine and Unisom, that drug can do it. But essentially any drug with a sensory component to it, particularly visual component, will amplify that experience of those phosphenes, because those drugs are influencing the neurons that are becoming spontaneously active to be more likely to become spontaneously active. So that's why I love the topic. So was there anything else on your mind?
No, that was a great explanation. Thank you. And the only drug that I occasionally have to make use of is a pill of cataflam, anti-inflammatory drug.
Gotcha.
Cataflam. I don't know if that has any influence on that.
I don't think so. I would be surprised. It's possible. I mean, because the visual system is so complicated, just changes in, vascular activity, like blood vessel activity in and around the eyes, can also influence vision, right? And so it's theoretically possible, but yeah, I doubt it. But anyways, Claudio, a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure to talk to you once again. Hope to talk to you again soon.
All right, thanks. Take care.
Claudio in Brazil. What can you tell us about schizophrenia? Well, my friend, Lear, let's say Lear, I can tell you quite a few things about schizophrenia, it turns out. In fact, last week on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, I talked about how and why people have hallucinations, specifically in the case of schizophrenia, but not exclusively. It could also apply to when people have hallucinations when they take hallucinogenic drugs like psychedelics, like magic mushrooms or LSD. And so you can check that out. But basically, so schizophrenia is a pretty complicated and diverse condition, right? And broadly speaking, you can bucket it into two categories. One are positive symptoms of schizophrenia, and one are the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And positive and negative, not in the sense that these are superpowers and these are the problems. Rather, positive symptoms of schizophrenia are the symptoms that you gain or that you develop after developing schizophrenia. So these are things like hallucinations, visual, they're usually auditory hallucinations among the hallucinations, but it can also be paranoia, hyperverbalization or word salad, these types of things. Negative symptoms are things like catatonia, that can be with rather severe schizophrenia, but it can also be flattened affect, where people with schizophrenia can tend to just not really broadcast their internal emotional experiences with facial expressions as humans typically do. And so those are the broad categories. Not everybody with schizophrenia has the same exact combination of symptoms, and of course there's schizophrenia, but then there's also schizoaffective disorder or schizotypal disorder, and these are sort of attenuated versions of schizophrenia. But so is there a neurological difference in schizophrenic people? Yes, definitely. Sort of like autism, there's a whole constellation of genes that have been associated with schizophrenia. Probably the most commonly highlighted are the genes that encode dopamine receptors, specifically D2, but just the dopaminergic system in general. For a long time, there was the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, where the theory was that there is just the ratio of levels of dopamine in one part of the brain to another part of the brain are just sort of decalibrated in the brain of somebody with schizophrenia, and so that's why you get, the symptoms that they exhibit. We now know that it's more complicated than that, but broadly speaking, it is some combination of just differences in anatomy, differences in neurochemistry, and so now when it comes to the hallucinations and delusions, the theory that was put forward by the group I discussed last week, again, youtube.com/anthropoid, was basically you can group sensory experience and cognitive activities into being higher level activities and lower level. Lower level activities are like literally, smelling a steak cooking, right? Just literally like the molecules hitting odor receptors, those chemoreceptors that enable us to smell in the first place, and that's the lower level, right? And then the higher level is you knowing that I smell steak. It means probably my wife is cooking steak, which means probably she's going to overcook it, so I should probably go stop her from doing that. I'm half kidding. She does like to cook her steak way too much, but anyways, that's the higher level, right? That is the sort of cognitive experience of that sensory experience. And when it comes to schizophrenia, you can have delusions or you can have hallucinations. And so their argument is that when it comes to hallucinations, they're a byproduct of aberrant activity at the lower level, that sensory process. And then folks that are experiencing delusions, it's aberrant activity at the higher level of cognitive processes. Hey, what's up, NYC boy? Good to see you over here on YouTube. youtube.com/anthropoid. Can you develop it later in life, and is it genetic? So generally speaking, schizophrenia emerges around puberty, not always before, or not always exclusively, but generally speaking, it commonly arises sort of towards the end of puberty, but any time around then, and there's a reason for that, at least we think. So one of the other theories that I didn't mention about schizophrenia is that as you're going through puberty, so that's an important thing to observe, right? That probably means that there's something important biologically that's occurring during puberty that is what promotes or causes schizophrenia. And so maybe we can figure out what that is, and then maybe we could help either prevent it or augment it such that people are able to function without suffering from schizophrenia. And so one of the very important things that happens during puberty, one of the many important things, is a process called synaptic pruning. And so as we're growing up, we have many more synaptic connections, points of communication that enable neurons to communicate with one another. We have many more synapses when we're younger than we do when we get older. And part of the reason is that part of puberty is sort of cleaving away, trimming away all of those synapses that are, for one reason or another, determined to be unnecessary, right? And then so your consciousness emerges from only the circuits that are like most critical to consciousness, right? Most critical to your life experience. And that process that determines which synapses go is regulated genetically. It's also regulated by experience, but importantly genetically. And so one of the theories for schizophrenia, also a theory that would apply to autism spectrum disorder, is that thing that regulates which synapses go is somehow unique. And as a function of it being unique, you get unique neuroanatomy. You get unique synaptic connectivity, what we call the connectome. And so as a result, that is almost certainly part of the reason for why schizophrenia emerges, during that period of synaptic pruning in puberty. But yes, it can develop later on in life. It's not exclusively an adolescent phenomenon. It can, of course, be induced by, or something that looks a lot like schizophrenia can be induced by heavy drug use. It can be induced by, head injuries. It's more, you probably wouldn't diagnose it as schizophrenia, but it can develop later on in life. Yes. Oh, also, generally speaking, when it comes to schizophrenia, something triggers its manifestation, right? It's not, or, and this is very broadly speaking, but it can be exposure to a traumatic event. It can be exposure to multiple traumatic events that we know for, in some cases, the more traumatic events you've had in your life, particularly during childhood, the more likely you are to experience psychosis later in life. And the greater the number of times you're likely to experience psychosis. So it's almost like they sort of correlate together. So there must be some connection between adverse traumatic experiences and cognitive function later on in life. But then for some people, rather than just experiencing psychosis, they develop schizophrenia. Now that can also be exposure to a drug like cannabis, for example, is sort of unusually highly associated with people developing psychosis, more so than other drugs. But other drugs also can do that too. Exposure to any drug, any mind-altering substance can trigger schizophrenia in people who are already predisposed to developing it. So that's part of why somebody can develop it later on in life, because that is when they had that sort of precipitating event. So now I'm hungry, and I'm getting hungry too. Can you get rid of it or only treat it? Only treat it. At this moment, we really only have treatments that are palliative, meaning that sort of reduce the severity, reduce the suffering. Oh, cool. Gee, sorry about that, Scott. A microphone blocks the number of people who are calling in, so I apologize for taking so long. Now tell me we're not gonna be able to connect. That would be lovely. Is there a theory on what in the brain causes color blindness? Yes, absolutely. In fact, we know. So there's different kinds of color blindness. Oh, it looks okay. So after we chat with Scott, let's talk about color blindness. So Scott in Ohio, what's on your mind?
Hi, Ian. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I've been better.
Yeah.
Physical reset by now. I have both gallstones and a hiatal hernia.
Oh my God.
That explains some things, I guess. But
Oof.
anyways, quick question. You mentioned, first off, if I recall correctly, you're a proponent of mindfulness and meditation, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. You were mentioning that the proponent, I use the right word, I don't know, lots of neurons or whatever it was in the gut, but it doesn't constitute a brain, but it still has a lot more of similar systems, but it's not consciousness. And it reminded me of what I read years ago when I was trying to, I haven't been able to concentrate enough on the phone asleep for God knows how long, but it was as I was doing the meditation, the steps, it felt like my consciousness, for lack of a better term, was shrinking and moving from my head down into my abdomen. And then I read that later, the exact same thing from someone else said that, like their consciousness descends into their abdomen. And I didn't see it before, so I wasn't imagining that it was happening to me. I read that after. And then other Eastern philosophers expressed that the dantian, the point in your abdomen by your navel, was like they hold that as like being very important for meditation. And I didn't know if that was related. Is it because of that phenomenon you were talking about?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting topic. So like one of the kind of fun kind of neurophilosophy exercises is to try and imagine like where you are, like within your body, like what would you consider to be like your point, the sort of the point from which your sense of identity, your sense of self emerges, right? So generally speaking, people will be like right here, right behind my eyes, that kind of thing. But it does sort of make one wonder. So what is it? Why do we even have that? Like, why do we even have a sense of like a sort of a substrate for our consciousness, or not that complicated, but like a point of reference from our body? And why would it be somewhere around here rather than your fingertips or something like that, or your abdomen, your solar plexus or whatever? We don't have a great a sort of comprehensive or satisfying explanation for that, but there are some really interesting studies that explore your sort of sense of body and like your sense of body in space. And so like, for example, there's all kinds of wild, like you can people can have all kinds of like strange kind of predispositions to feeling as though their arm is not part of them, or that they don't control their arm, or their arm has a mind of its own. There are people who have, there's a disorder where people are just certain that they were born to be without an arm, despite the fact that they have an arm. And so they seek surgeons who will be willing to remove it from them. And, you know, so and there's just, I could go on. And I really should review that literature because it's really wacky and funny, or fun. But the point is that your sense of body and space is, like everything else, a byproduct of specific neurons within the probably sensory motor cortex, the parietal lobe, that sort of, that determine that in some way. And when it comes to, like, does your consciousness actually drift? Like, let's say that there is a sort of seed of consciousness, which, by the way, there isn't really. It's like, it is the whole brain is participating in producing, your consciousness. It's influenced by neurons in the gut, in the enteric nervous system, but it's only influenced by like the nutrients that it absorbs, the neurotransmitters that it produces that cause various inflammatory processes to occur, and that kind of thing. So there is no reason to believe that the thing in your body that's producing consciousness has migrated anywhere to, like, your vagus nerve or your enteric nervous system. But one of the cool things about one of the cool exercises that people have when you're trying to learn mindfulness meditation is to just, like, hyper focus on specific body parts. So, like, this is kind of a fun exercise. Just all do it together. So, taking a deep breath. And then, close your eyes, and then focus on what the feelings are that you're experiencing on your big toes. Like, where is it? Are you wearing a sock? Is it pressing up against your big toe? Are you wearing slippers or shoes? Is your foot on carpet? Can you feel the carpet on, your big toe? And you spend, like, minutes scrutinizing everything that there is to experience from your big toe, and then you move up to your calf. Okay, think about what your calves feel like, and you're breathing deeply this whole time, right? And are you wearing pants? Do you have leg hair? Is it tickled by the pants? Like that kind of thing. And I think that there is an interesting psychological effect of doing that with your conscious attention. And I suspect that those folks, from those wisdom traditions, probably tapped into something that is psychologically sort of hygienic about doing that exercise, engaging in that exercise of, like, moving the focus of your awareness around your body away from just its sort of natural disposition, which is somewhere probably in your head, where you are sort of at the whims of your cognitive processes, where, like, you don't control what feelings you're going to have in 5 minutes. You don't control what feelings you're going to have in 10 minutes, right? Or even oftentimes what thoughts you're going to experience in that time. And so it could be just the case that drifting your consciousness, this is my own speculation, drifting your consciousness, your focus elsewhere can sort of relieve you of that lack of control for a period of time. But anyways, yeah, so I know that was a very meandering response, but yeah, the consciousness itself never departs from the brain.
Okay, I was just wondering about that, so thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, thanks for calling in, man. Good luck with everything. I hope you start feeling better sometime soon.
Yeah. I'm trying to remind that I'm going to remember to let you know if I find out. It just sucks that it's like at the end of the year, right when I get my deductible. Now I got to try and squeeze some surgery in January. Then I'm back to paying out of pocket.
Yeah, fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
hang in there.
Thanks. Take care.
Talk to you soon. Okay. After the human genome completely mapped, what will science do, with that info? Yeah, so the Human Genome Project, right. So that's a great topic. So basically, genetics kind of suffered from, or the Human Genome Project kind of suffered from a lot of the same things that stem cell biology suffered from, which was, it was heralded as, once we complete this project, we will be able to cure everything. And there is some validity. There's definitely validity to the claim that the more we know about genetics, human genetics, the better we'll be able to treat a whole wide variety of conditions, of diseases and disorders. Just like with stem cells, where, what we thought was, given that there are so many diseases and disorders that arise from the loss of various types of cells, including just aging, given that aging is a byproduct of aberrant cells, maybe you could just replace them. Or when it comes to, Parkinson's disease, maybe just replace those lost dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra. And that's still true. The trouble is that it's more complicated than just that initial question. It's more complicated than just discovering stem cells or, mapping out the human genome. So yes, we have the roadmap, right? Or it's even simpler. It's like we know where all the roads are, right? With the the human genome. Although every human has a different genome, of course. So there's some variation there. But we've mapped out the approximately 22,000 genes, or at least we know what the sequences are. Now the hard work, which is grueling, but very important, is to identify what the functions of all of those genes are. And then, while we have 22,000 around genes, we have a lot more genetic material that does not encode for proteins, but does do something. So for a long time, we thought it was all just junk DNA, just like literally just filler between the important stuff, between the genes. But now we know that a lot of those sequences that, again, do not encode for proteins, they're never expressed. What they do is they influence how the genome is physically arranged, and therefore can influence when and where and how much a given gene is expressed, right? So you have areas of the genome that will enhance the expression of another gene. You have areas that will, make it less likely to be expressed. And so all of this to say, we know where the roads are on the map. What we don't know is where the roads lead, what's the state of the roads, right? What's around the roads. If you want to get to a supermarket or whatever, you don't know where your supermarket is, right? Now we're in the process of identifying, that's where the supermarket is, and this is the road to get there. Okay, that's just one question. Now we need to know about a whole bunch of other things, right? So now that's the stage in which we're currently living, but I do think it will yield, particularly upon the inception of CRISPR-Cas9, which is a technique that enables us to very precisely and very efficiently edit genome level genetics. As we develop a more completed genetics, with that tool, we will be able to do a lot. We'll have a ton of agency. Essentially, evolution by natural selection is essentially no longer applicable to us. That's a huge exaggeration, but yeah. Hey, Paul. Oh my God. I don't know if you're the person I recall interacting with years ago. I think you are, though. You're the educator, I believe. I can't remember if you were from Scotland. I thought you were from somewhere else in the UK, but if you are, that's awesome. It's great to see you. Oh gosh, how long has it been? Oh, it's been a while. Okay, I should call it a day. I have a YouTube channel. It's called youtube.com/anthropoid, and you can get to it by my profile page on Periscope. And today I talked about a potential new treatment for addiction, and alcohol addiction in particular, but addiction. And it involves memory and engrams, and I get into a lot more about how memory functions in this context. So youtube.com/anthropoid. I have a podcast, Wired to be Weird, on iTunes, Stitcher, and all over the place, where I talk about everything from dreams and drugs and dementia to deja vu, and so you can check that out. And otherwise, I hope you have an awesome week. I'm going to try and go live again sometime this week, around Thanksgiving-ish. Hope you're all engaging in safe behavior over this time period. Now is not the time to let up. It's game time right now. Game time. COVID-19 game time. So be serious and wear a face covering. Keep your distance. Protect your family. Protect the people you love. Protect your fellow Americans. It's not as complicated as it could be. So, yeah, thanks. Have a great week. And until next time, or I hope to see you same time, same place next week. See you there. Have a great week. And I will give hugs to the baby. Thank you. All right, folks on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. It has been encouraging to watch some of the view numbers go up and subscription numbers go up. But if you enjoy these types of conversations, and if you enjoy, today's topic, addiction, dementia, dreams, these topics. I haven't gotten into dreams very much on YouTube, actually. I'm realizing, so I could get into that. But anyways, if you're interested, probe, perturb the subscription button. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.